The sun was barely peeking over the hills when Thomas heard his daughter's footsteps on the wooden floor. Every morning started the same way in their little house on the Texas frontier. 8-year-old Lucy would wake up, wash her face in the basin by the window, and help her father prepare breakfast before the day's work began. Their home wasn't much to look at from the outside. Just a simple wooden cabin with a stone chimney and 2 small windows that Thomas had built with his own hands 4 years ago. But inside it felt warm and safe. Lucy's drawings covered one wall, and her mother's old quilt still hung over the back of the rocking chair. Thomas couldn't bring himself to put it away, even 3 years after the fever took his wife. "Morning, Papa," Lucy said, tying her long brown hair back with a piece of ribbon. She was getting taller every day, and Thomas noticed she was starting to look more like her mother. The same bright green eyes, the same stubborn chin when she didn't want to do something. "Morning, little bird," Thomas replied, using the nickname that always made her smile. He was already dressed and ready for the day's work. Living on the frontier meant there was always something that needed fixing, feeding, or protecting. Their daily routine was like a dance they had practiced 1,000 times. Lucy would gather eggs from the chicken coop while Thomas milked their cow, Bessie. Then they would eat breakfast together at the small wooden table Thomas had made. Usually it was eggs, sunbread Lucy had helped bake the day before, and milk, still warm from Bessie. "Can I help you fix the fence today?" Lucy asked, spreading butter on her bread. She was always eager to help with the ranch work, and Thomas was proud of how capable she had become. Most children her age lived in towns with other families around, but Lucy had learned to be independent out of necessity. "Course you can," Thomas said. "But first we need to check on the horses and make sure they have enough water." Their land stretched across a small valley, hidden away from the main roads that connected the scattered settlements. Thomas had chosen this spot carefully when he first came to Texas. It was far enough from town to avoid trouble, but close enough that he could make the 2-day journey when they needed supplies. The isolation had its advantages. They rarely saw strangers, which meant fewer problems. Thomas had heard stories from other ranchers about conflicts with local tribes, cattle thieves, and all sorts of dangers that came with frontier life. But their little valley seemed blessed with peace and quiet. After breakfast, they walked together to the barn. It was Thomas's pride and joy, built from strong oak logs that would last for decades. Inside, their 2 horses, Thunder and Star, were already awake and waiting for their morning feed. Thunder was a big brown horse that Thomas used for the heavy work around the ranch. Star was smaller and gentler, perfect for Lucy to ride when they needed to check on the cattle grazing in the far pastures. Lucy loved spending time in the barn. The smell of hay and leather, the soft sounds the animals made, the way the morning sunlight streamed through the gaps between the logs, it all made her feel content and safe. When her father was busy with other work, she would often sit in the barn reading one of her books or practicing her letters in the dirt floor with a stick. "Papa, do you think we'll always live here?" Lucy asked as she brushed Star's coat. It was a question she had been asking more often lately. Thomas paused in his work of spreading fresh hay for the horses. It wasn't an easy question to answer. Life on the frontier was unpredictable. Weather, sickness, money troubles, any number of things could force them to leave their little valley. But looking at his daughter's hopeful face, he wanted to give her the security she needed. "I hope so, little bird. This is our home, and we've worked hard to make it what it is." The truth was, Thomas couldn't imagine living anywhere else. After his wife died, this place had become his refuge. Every fence post he had driven into the ground, every improvement he had made to the house, every crop he had planted, it all represented his determination to build something lasting for Lucy. Their cattle grazed peacefully in the meadows beyond. The barn. Thomas had started with just 6 cows and a bull, but now his herd had grown to nearly 20 head. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to provide for their simple needs. Once a year, he would drive some of the cattle to market in the nearest town, and the money would buy them supplies for the following year. The work was hard, but Thomas found satisfaction in it. His hands were rough and calloused from years of building, fixing, and farming. His back ached most evenings from the physical demands of ranch life. But when he saw Lucy running through their meadows, laughing as she chased butterflies or helped herd the cattle, he knew every struggle had been worth it. Neighbors were few and far. Between and their part of Texas, the closest family lived 15 miles away, and Thomas saw them maybe 4 times a year. Lucy had never complained about the loneliness, but Thomas worried sometimes that she was missing out on the friendships and experiences that other children took for granted. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, they would sit together in their small living room. Thomas would read to Lucy from one of the few books they owned, or help her practice writing letters on her slate board. She was a bright child, curious about everything, and Thomas did his best to answer her endless questions about the world. Beyond their valley, "Papa, what are those mountains called?" she would ask, pointing toward the distant peaks. "Why do the cattle always know when it's going to rain? Do you think there are other families like us living in valleys like this one?" Thomas answered as best he could, but sometimes he felt the weight of being Lucy's only teacher, her only companion, her only connection to the wider world. He had been thinking about taking her to town more often, maybe even finding a way for her to attend school with other children, but for now their quiet life in the hidden valley was all they knew. Every morning brought the same peaceful routine. Every evening ended with the same sense of accomplishment and gratitude for what they had built together. The barn had become the center of their little world. It was where they stored the hay that would feed their animals through the winter months. It housed their tools, their extra supplies, and served as a workshop where Thomas could repair harnesses and farm equipment. Lucy had claimed a corner of the loft as her special place, where she kept her collection of interesting rocks and the nest that had fallen from the rafters last spring. Neither of them realized that their peaceful barn, their sanctuary and workplace, was already sheltering a secret that would soon change everything they thought they knew about their quiet life on the frontier. The signs were there. Small disturbances in the hay, a few missing ears of corn from their stored grain, faint marks in the dirt that didn't quite match the hoofprints of their animals. But Thomas and Lucy were focused on their daily routines, the simple pleasures and the comfort of their predictable life together. They had no idea that their world was about to be turned upside down by a discovery that would challenge everything they believed about the frontier, about themselves, and about the delicate balance of survival in their hidden valley. The heat was already unbearable by 7 in the morning, and Thomas knew it was going to be one of those days where the sun would beat down mercilessly until evening. August in Texas could be brutal, and this particular morning felt like the air itself was on fire. He had planned to fix the broken harness for thunder before the temperature became too much to bear. Lucy was still sleeping peacefully in her bed when Thomas quietly slipped out of the house. He grabbed his tool bag and headed toward the barn, looking forward to getting this repair work done in the cooler air inside the wooden structure. The harness had been giving him trouble for weeks, and yesterday it had finally snapped completely when thunder pulled too hard against a stubborn fence post. As Thomas approached the barn, he noticed something odd. Thunder and Star were both acting strange, moving restlessly in their stalls and making nervous sounds. Thunder was pawing at the ground and tossing his big head, while Star kept looking toward the far corner of the barn and snorting softly. In all his years of working with horses, Thomas had learned to pay attention when they sensed something he couldn't see. "Easy, boy," he whispered to Thunder, but the horse remained agitated. Thomas felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Something wasn't right. He always carried his rifle when he worked around the ranch. Life on the frontier had taught him that being prepared wasn't just smart, it was necessary for survival. Wild animals, rattlesnakes, and sometimes dangerous men passed through these parts, but as he gripped the familiar weight of the rifle, Thomas hoped he wouldn't need to use it. The barn was dimmer than usual, and Thomas's eyes needed a moment to adjust after the bright morning sunlight. He climbed carefully up the wooden ladder to the loft where he kept his tools, moving slowly and listening for any sound that might explain why the horses were so upset. That's when he heard it. A soft creaking sound from the far corner of the loft where they stored the extra hay bales. It was the kind of sound a floorboard makes when someone shifts their weight, trying to stay quiet but not quite succeeding. Thomas froze on the ladder, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. He wasn't alone in the barn. Moving as quietly as possible, he pulled himself up into the loft and crept toward the corner where the sound had come from. The hay bales were stacked differently than he remembered, arranged almost like a wall to hide whatever was behind them. Thomas had been in this barn hundreds of times, and he knew every inch of it. Someone had definitely moved those bales. His hands were shaking slightly as he moved one of the hay bales aside, and what he saw behind. It made his breath catch in his throat. A young man, barely more than a boy really, was huddled in the corner. But this wasn't just any boy. His skin was dark bronze, his long black hair was braided with leather strips and feathers, and there were painted designs on his face that Thomas recognized immediately. This was a Comanche warrior, though he looked far too young to be riding. With any war party, the boy was in bad shape. There was dried blood on his left shoulder, where his buckskin shirt was torn, and his breathing was shallow and labored. Fever made his dark eyes glassy and unfocused, and when he tried to move, Thomas could see the pain that shot through his wounded body. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Thomas kept his rifle ready, but not pointed directly at the young warrior. The boy looked back at him with a mixture of fear and defiance, but he was clearly too weak to fight or run away. Thomas's mind was racing. Every story he had ever heard about Comanche raids flashed through his thoughts. The settlements that had been burned, the families that had disappeared, the reasons why frontier families like his lived in constant awareness of danger. This boy represented everything Thomas had been taught to fear, but looking at him now, wounded and feverish, hiding in a barn like a scared animal, Thomas saw something different. This wasn't a fierce warrior or a dangerous enemy. This was a hurt kid, who was probably more afraid than Thomas was. The sound of Lucy's voice calling from the house made Thomas's blood run cold. She was awake and looking for him, probably wondering why he wasn't making breakfast yet. In a few minutes, she might come looking for him in the barn, and Thomas couldn't let that happen. He couldn't let his 8-year-old daughter walk into this situation. "Papa, where are you?" Lucy's voice was getting closer. Thomas looked back at the wounded boy, and something inside him made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of shouting for Lucy to stay away, instead of pointing his rifle at the young warrior, Thomas set his weapon aside and moved closer to get a better look at the wound. The boy's eyes widened in confusion and fear. He tried to speak, but only managed to whisper in a language Thomas didn't understand. The words were foreign, but the tone was unmistakable. The boy was asking for something, maybe pleading, maybe just trying to explain how he had ended up here. "She," Thomas whispered, holding up his hand in what he hoped was a peaceful gesture. "You're hurt bad?" The shoulder wound looked like it had come from a gunshot, probably a few days old based on how it had started to heal around the edges. But infection was setting in, and without proper care, the boy would probably die in this barn. Thomas had treated enough injured animals to recognize the signs of serious trouble. Lucy's footsteps were on the porch now, and Thomas knew he had maybe 30 seconds before she came looking for him. He made the kind of split-second decision that would haunt him for weeks afterward, the kind of choice that goes against everything you think you know about yourself. He grabbed the old horse blanket that was folded nearby and gently covered the boy, then quickly rearranged the hay bales to hide him again. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do for now. "Stay quiet," Thomas whispered, not even sure if the boy could understand English. "I'll be back." The young warrior's fevered eyes followed Thomas as he moved away, and there was something in that look that Thomas would remember forever. It wasn't hatred or the wild defiance of a captured enemy. It was something closer to hope mixed with desperate fear, the look of someone who had been expecting to die, and suddenly wasn't sure what was going to happen next. Thomas climbed down from the loft just as Lucy appeared in the barn doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes and looking around for her father. "There you are, Papa. I woke up and you weren't in the kitchen. Are you fixing Thunder's harness already?" "That's right, little bird," Thomas managed to say, though his voice sounded strange, even to his own ears. "Just getting an early start before it gets too hot." Lucy nodded and headed back toward the house to start breakfast preparations, completely unaware that their lives had just changed forever. Thomas watched her go, then looked back up toward the loft where a wounded Comanche boy was hidden among the hay bales, and wondered what in the world he was going to do next. The morning heat was already becoming oppressive, but Thomas felt cold despite the sweat on his forehead. He had just made a choice that could get him and Lucy killed or worse. Harboring an enemy, even a wounded one, was not something frontier families did if they wanted to survive, but something about that boy's eyes, something about seeing him hurt and afraid instead of dangerous and threatening, had changed Thomas's understanding of the situation completely. For the first time in his life, the enemy had a face, and it was the face of someone's child. Thomas felt like he was living in two different worlds. During the day, when Lucy was around, he had to pretend everything was normal. They would eat breakfast together, do their chores, and talk about everyday things like the weather or which cows needed to be moved to fresh grass. But every spare moment he could find, Thomas would slip away to the barn with supplies hidden under his shirt. The first few days were the hardest. The young warrior was burning with fever, drifting in and out of consciousness, and Thomas wasn't even sure the boy would survive. He brought water, clean cloth for bandages, and some of the medicine he kept for treating sick animals. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. Thomas had to be incredibly careful. He would wait until Lucy was busy with something in the house, then quickly grab what he needed and hurry to the barn. Sometimes he pretended to be checking on the horses or organizing tools, just in case Lucy happened to look out the window and see him going back and forth. On the third day, the boy's fever finally broke. Thomas was cleaning the infected wound when the young warrior's eyes opened and focused clearly for the first time. He tried to sit up quickly, probably ready to fight or run, but the pain in his shoulder made him gasp and fall back against the— "Hey, easy there," Thomas said softly, the same tone he used with frightened animals. "You're safe. Nobody knows you're here." The boy stared at him with wide, dark eyes full of confusion. He spoke a few words in his own language, and while Thomas couldn't understand the words, the tone sounded like a question. Maybe he was asking why Thomas was helping him instead of turning him over to the authorities. Thomas pointed to himself. "Thomas," he said clearly. Then he pointed to the boy and raised his eyebrows. Hoping to learn his name, the young warrior hesitated for a long moment, then touched his chest. "Ayana," he said quietly. The name meant something beautiful in his language, though Thomas didn't know that yet. Over the next few days they began to understand each other better. Ayana knew some English words, probably learned from trading or previous contact with settlers. Thomas discovered that the boy was only 16, barely older than Lucy in some ways. Though his hard life had made him seem more mature, through gestures and the few words they shared, Ayana told Thomas his story. He had been with a small hunting party when they encountered soldiers. There had been shooting, and Ayana had been hit in the shoulder. In the confusion, he had become separated from the other warriors and had been wandering alone for days before he found Thomas's barn. Thomas learned that Ayana's people called him Swift Fox, because of how quietly he could move through the forest. The boy had been hiding in the barn for almost a week before Thomas found him, surviving on stolen corn and water from the horse trough. He had been too weak and feverish to travel, and too afraid to approach the house for help. What surprised Thomas most was how intelligent and thoughtful Ayana seemed. The stories Thomas had heard made all Comanche warriors sound like savage fighters who lived only for war and raiding. But this boy asked questions about Thomas's life, seemed curious about the books he saw Thomas carrying, and even smiled when Thomas showed him a small carving he had made for Lucy. Meanwhile, Lucy was starting to notice that something was different about her father. Thomas had always been a creature of habit, but lately he seemed distracted and nervous. He would forget what he was saying in the middle of conversations, and he kept making excuses to go to the barn at odd times. "Papa, are you feeling all right?" Lucy asked one evening as they sat down for dinner. "You seem worried about something?" Thomas nearly choked on his food. "I'm fine, little bird. Just thinking about winter preparations. Want to make sure we have enough hay stored up." Lucy accepted the explanation, but she wasn't completely satisfied. Her father had been acting strange for over a week now, and her natural curiosity was getting the better of her. She began paying more attention to his movements, watching from her bedroom window when he made his mysterious trips to the barn one afternoon. While Thomas thought Lucy was napping, she quietly followed him partway to the barn. She hid behind the chicken coop and watched as her father emerged from the barn carrying what looked like bloodied cloth. Her heart started beating faster. Was one of their animals badly hurt? That night, Lucy pretended to go to bed early but actually sat by her window in the dark, watching the barn. Sure enough, around 10 o'clock, she saw a dim light moving around inside. Her father was in there with a lantern, doing something that required him to stay much longer than feeding the horses would take. Thomas, meanwhile, was teaching Ayana how to say basic English words while the boy showed him hand signals that his people used for hunting. It was during one of these quiet conversations that Ayana told Thomas something that changed everything, using a mixture of English words and drawings in the dirt floor. Ayana explained that his people knew about Thomas and Lucy. They had been watching the little ranch for years, but they had never attacked it or stolen from it because they considered Thomas's family to be protected. Protected by who? Thomas asked. Not understanding, Ayana pointed toward the hills surrounding their valley and made gestures that Thomas interpreted as spirits or sacred places. Through patient explanation, Thomas began to understand that their ranch was built in a location that Ayana's people considered special, maybe even holy. The isolated valley where Thomas had chosen to build his home was actually a place where Comanche families had camped for generations during certain seasons. This revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. All these years he had thought their safety came from being hidden and isolated, but actually they had been living under the protection of the very people he had been taught to fear. The Comanche had been watching over them, making sure no harm came to the small family in their sacred valley. Your woman, Ayana said carefully, using some of his limited English. She sick, yes? 3 winters past? Thomas nodded, surprised. That Ayana knew about his wife's death, Ayana made more gestures and spoke softly in his own language, then tried to translate. My grandmother ... she pray for her. For the woman with kind spirit. Thomas felt tears sting his eyes. While he had been grieving alone, thinking the whole world was hostile and dangerous, there had been people in the hills praying for his family and watching over them with genuine care and concern. The young warrior went on to explain that he hadn't randomly chosen Thomas's barn to hide in. When he was wounded and separated from his people, he had remembered the stories about the protected family in the sacred valley. He had hoped that if he could reach their land, he might find the kindness that his elders had always spoken about. That night, Thomas lay awake staring at the ceiling, his entire understanding of his world completely turned upside down. Everything he thought he knew about the frontier, about his neighbors, about the dangers surrounding his family had been wrong. The savage enemies had actually been guardian angels, and the young warrior he was risking everything to save was part of a community that had been quietly protecting his daughter for years, but his revelation would have to wait. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, because Lucy's curiosity was about to lead her to a discovery that would force all of their secrets into the open. The sound of horses thundering across the valley floor made Thomas's blood turn to ice. He was in the barn with Ayana, changing the bandages on the boy's shoulder, when the unmistakable noise of multiple riders approaching fast reached their ears. Thomas had lived on the frontier long enough to know the difference between travelers and trouble, and this definitely sounded like trouble. Ayana's eyes went wide with fear, and he immediately tried to stand up despite the pain in his shoulder. His warrior instincts told him to run or fight, but Thomas gently pushed him back down into the hay. Stay quiet, Thomas whispered urgently. Don't move, don't make a sound. Through the gaps in the barn walls, Thomas could see dust clouds rising from the direction of the main trail. 6 or 7 riders were approaching fast, and the way they moved suggested military discipline. His heart sank as he realized what this probably meant. Someone had reported Comanche activity in the area, and the cavalry had come to investigate. Thomas quickly threw loose hay over Ayana. trying to make it look natural while completely concealing the young warrior. His hands were shaking as he worked, knowing that if they were caught, both he and Lucy could face serious consequences. Harboring an enemy of the territory wasn't just illegal, it could be considered treason. "Thomas, what's happening?" Lucy's voice came from outside the barn. She had obviously heard the approaching horses too and had come running to find her father. "Get back to the house, little bird," Thomas called out, trying to keep his voice calm. "We have visitors coming." But it was too late. The riders were already coming around the bend, and Thomas could see the blue uniforms and military bearing that confirmed his worst fears. This was a cavalry patrol, and they looked like they meant business. The leader of the group was a tall man with steel-gray hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years on the frontier. His uniform was dusty but well-maintained, and he carried himself with the authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. Thomas had never seen him before, but his reputation preceded him. This had to be Captain William Hayes, known throughout the territory for his harsh methods in dealing with what the military called the Indian problem. "You Thomas Morrison?" the captain called out as he dismounted from his horse. His men remained mounted, hands resting casually near their weapons. "Yes, sir, that's me," Thomas replied, stepping out of the barn and trying to look as normal as possible. "What can I do for you gentlemen?" Captain Hayes looked around the ranch with sharp, calculating eyes. "We're tracking a Comanche warrior who escaped during a skirmish 3 days ago. Wounded, probably desperate. We have reason to believe he might have passed through this area." Thomas felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the morning chill. "Haven't seen hide nor hair of any Indians around here, Captain. Been quiet as usual." "That's so?" Hayes stepped closer, and Thomas could see the suspicion in his cold blue eyes. "Funny thing about that, we found tracks leading in this direction, and this is the only ranch for miles around. Seems like a wounded man might be drawn to a place like this, looking for supplies or shelter." Lucy had emerged from the house and was standing on the porch, watching the soldiers with wide, frightened eyes. Thomas's protective instincts flared up, and he stepped slightly between his daughter and the armed men. "Like I said, Captain, we haven't seen anything unusual. Just been going about our normal business." Hayes studied Thomas's face carefully, looking for any sign of deception. "Mind if we take a look around? Check your buildings, make sure this Comanche isn't hiding somewhere on your property?" It wasn't really a question, and Thomas knew he had no choice but to agree. "Of course, Captain. Search wherever you need to." The next 20 minutes felt like the longest of Thomas's life. The soldiers spread out across the ranch, checking every building, every possible hiding place. 2 of them went through the house, while Lucy watched nervously from the porch. Others searched the chicken coop, the root cellar, and the small shed where Thomas stored his tools. Meanwhile, Captain Hayes himself headed straight for the barn, with Thomas following behind and trying not to look as terrified as he felt. Inside, the horses were still agitated, probably sensing the tension in the air. Hayes examined every stall, every corner, even climbing up into the loft where Ayana was hidden beneath the loose hay. Thomas held his breath as the captain walked directly over the spot where the young warrior was concealed. Hayes paused, looking around the loft carefully, and for a horrible moment Thomas thought they were caught. But the captain apparently didn't notice anything out of place, and he climbed back down the ladder. "Lot of hay you got stored up here," Hayes commented casually. "Yes, sir," Thomas managed to reply. "Got to be prepared for winter. Never know how hard it might be." "That's smart thinking." Hayes continued his search, poking into dark corners and checking behind stored equipment. "You know, Morrison, harboring enemies of the territory is a serious crime, punishable by death in some cases." "I understand that, Captain. But like I told you, we haven't seen any Indians around here." Hayes stopped his search and turned to face Thomas directly. "You seem nervous, Morrison. Something making you uncomfortable about this visit?" Thomas tried to steady his voice. "Well, sir, it's not every day we have soldiers searching our property. Makes a man wonder what kind of danger might be lurking around that we don't know about." It was a reasonable answer, and Hayes seemed to accept it. But his sharp eyes continued studying Thomas's face. Looking for any crack in his story. The search of the barn was thorough, but ultimately unsuccessful. Hayes checked every obvious hiding place, but he didn't think to dig through the loose hay in the loft where a wounded warrior lay perfectly still, probably barely breathing. When the soldiers finished searching the house, one of them approached. Captain Hayes with a report. "Nothing suspicious inside, sir. Just normal family belongings." "The girl seems genuinely confused about why we're here." Hayes nodded and walked over to where Lucy was still standing on the porch. Thomas's heart raced as the intimidating officer crouched down to Lucy's eye level. "Hello there, young lady. I'm Captain Hayes. Have you seen any strangers around your ranch lately? Anyone who doesn't belong here?" Lucy looked at her father, then back at the captain. "No, sir, just Papa and me like always. What about unusual sounds at night? Anything that might have scared you or seemed different from normal?" "The horses were acting funny yesterday," Lucy said innocently. "But Papa said it was probably just a wild animal passing through." Thomas's blood went cold. Lucy was telling the truth about the horses being agitated, but he prayed she wouldn't say anything that might make the captain suspicious. Hayes asked a few more questions, but Lucy's answers were consistent and believable. She genuinely seemed to know nothing about any Indians in the area, which was exactly what Hayes would expect from a sheltered frontier child. After nearly an hour of searching, Captain Hayes finally gathered his men to leave, but before mounting his horse, he walked back over to Thomas with a stern expression. "Morrison, I want to be very clear about something. If you see any sign of Indian activity in this area, you report it immediately. Don't try to handle it yourself. Don't wait to see what happens. You ride straight to the nearest military post and tell them what you've seen." "Yes, sir, I understand." "I hope you do. Because if I find out later that you knew something and didn't report it, things will go very badly for you and your daughter." Very badly indeed. The threat was clear and unmistakable. Hayes wasn't just talking about legal consequences. He was talking about the kind of frontier justice that left families destroyed and properties burned. As the soldiers rode away, Thomas stood in his yard watching until they disappeared over the hill. Only then did he allow himself to breathe normally. Again, Lucy came over and took his hand, still shaken by the intimidating visit. "Papa, why were they looking for an Indian? Are we in danger?" Thomas squeezed her hand gently. "No, little bird, we're safe. They were just being careful, making sure everyone in the area is protected." But as he spoke those reassuring words, Thomas knew that everything had changed. The secret he was keeping in his barn had just become infinitely more dangerous, and the next few days would test everything he believed about right and wrong. After the soldiers rode away, Thomas stood in his yard for a long time, watching the dust settle on the horizon. His hands were still shaking from the close call, and his mind was racing with questions about what to do next. Lucy stayed close beside him, sensing that something important had just happened, even though she didn't fully understand what it was. "Papa, you look scared," she said quietly, taking his rough hand in her small one. Thomas looked down at his daughter's worried face and realized he couldn't keep lying to her. She was smart and observant, and after what had just happened with the soldiers, she deserved to know the truth. Besides, keeping this secret was becoming impossible, and Thomas was exhausted from trying to live two different lives. "Little bird, we need to talk," he said gently. "There's something I need to show you, and I need you to promise me you'll listen with an open heart." Lucy nodded seriously. She had always trusted her father completely, and even though his words frightened her a little, she was ready to hear whatever he had to tell her. They walked together toward the barn, and Thomas felt like he was about to change his daughter's life forever. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that everything she's been taught about enemies and danger might be wrong? How do you prepare a child for the complexity of the adult world? "Remember how I told you there are different kinds of people in the world?" Thomas began as they reached the barn door. "Some who look different from us, some who speak different languages?" "Yes, Papa, like the people in town who came from other countries." "That's right. Well, there's someone I want you to meet. Someone who's been hurt and needed help." "But Lucy, this person might look different from anyone you've ever seen before." and I need you to not be afraid." Lucy's eyes grew wide with curiosity and a little bit of fear. "Is it someone hiding in our barn?" Thomas nodded. "His name is Ayana, and he's been here for about 2 weeks now. He was shot and hurt badly, and he came here looking for a safe place to heal." As they climbed up into the loft, Thomas gently moved aside the hay bales that concealed Ayana. The young warrior was awake and alert, having heard the entire search by the soldiers. When he saw Lucy, his eyes filled with surprise and concern. Lucy's first reaction was exactly what Thomas had expected. She gasped and stepped back, pressing against her father's side. Ayana looked exactly like the wild Indians from the scary stories she had heard, with his long braided hair, bronze skin, and the traditional clothing that marked him as Comanche. But then something interesting happened. Instead of running away or crying, Lucy studied Ayana's face carefully. She saw that he was young, probably not much older than some of the teenagers in town. She noticed that his eyes were kind, not fierce or frightening. Most importantly, she could see that he was hurt and vulnerable, lying there with bandages on his shoulder and looking more scared than scary. "He's just a boy," she whispered to her father. "That's right, little bird. He's someone's son, just like you're my daughter." Ayana had been watching this interaction carefully, and now he spoke softly in his limited English. "You his daughter. I hear you sing sometimes. Pretty voice." Lucy was amazed that this stranger had been listening to her sing during her evening chores and had understood enough English to compliment her. It made him seem more real, more human, less like the monsters from the frightening stories. Over the next hour, Thomas explained everything to Lucy. He told her about finding Ayana wounded in the barn, about nursing him back to health, and about the incredible things Ayana had revealed about their family's protection over the years. "You mean his people have been watching over us?" Lucy asked, trying to understand this amazing revelation. "That's right. All this time we thought we were alone and had to protect ourselves, but actually we've had guardians we never knew about." Ayana, despite his limited English, managed to communicate more of this story to Lucy. He showed her the traditional patterns painted on a small piece of leather he carried, explained through gestures how his people lived in harmony with the land, and even taught her a few words in his language. Lucy was fascinated. She had never met anyone from a completely different culture before, and her natural curiosity overcame her initial fear. She asked Ayana about his family, his home, what kinds of food his people ate, and dozens of other questions that poured out of her eager mind. What surprised Thomas most was how easily Lucy accepted this new reality. Children, he realized, were often more open to differences than adults. Lucy didn't have years of prejudice and fear built up in her mind. To her, Ayana was simply an interesting new friend who happened to look different and speak a different language. As the days passed, their barn became a place of learning and friendship. Ayana taught Lucy traditional ways of reading animal tracks and predicting weather changes. He showed her how his people made medicines from plants that grew wild around their ranch. In return, Lucy shared her books with him, teaching him to read simple English words and showing him her drawings. Thomas watched these interactions with amazement and growing respect for both children. Lucy's acceptance and Ayana's gentle patience with her questions created a bridge between two very different worlds. They were proving that understanding and friendship were possible, even across cultural divides that had seemed impossible to cross. But Thomas knew this peaceful time couldn't last forever. Ayana was getting stronger every day, and soon he would be well enough to return to his people. The young warrior was eager to rejoin his family, who were probably worried sick about him. But the parting would be difficult for all of them. One evening, as autumn colors began appearing on the trees surrounding their valley, Ayana told them it was time for him to leave. His shoulder had healed well, and he felt strong enough to make the journey back to his tribe. "My people think I am dead," he explained in his careful English. "They mourn for me. I must go home." Lucy's eyes filled with tears. "Will we ever see you again?" Ayana smiled and touched her cheek gently. "The valley is a sacred place for my people. We watch over it always." I will watch over you, little sister. Before he left, Ayana gave Lucy a small leather pouch decorated with beads and painted symbols. For protection, he said. And to remember. To Thomas, he gave a piece of carved stone that he explained was a token of friendship and respect. You saved my life when you could have taken it. This makes you brother to my people. The morning Ayana left was bittersweet. He slipped away before dawn, moving silently through the forest with the skills that had earned him his nickname of Swift Fox. Thomas and Lucy found only a small arrangement of stones and feathers where he had been sleeping, a traditional blessing. For the family that had protected him, their life returned to its normal routine, but everything was different now. Thomas and Lucy shared a profound secret that had changed how they saw the world around them. They understood that the frontier wasn't just a place of danger and conflict, but also a place where unexpected friendships could bloom and where understanding could bridge even the deepest cultural divides. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Lucy would look toward the hills and wonder if Ayana was out there somewhere, keeping his promise to watch over them. And Thomas would remember the lesson he had learned about judging people by their actions rather than their appearance, about the courage it takes to help someone when the world tells you they're your enemy. Their hidden valley remained peaceful. But now they knew why. They were part of a larger story of protection and respect that few people on either side of the frontier conflict would ever understand. And that knowledge made them different, wiser, and more hopeful about the possibility of peace in a troubled world.